In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the useReducerHook in React. In the React documentation, they describe useReducer as an alternative to useState. Now, it's interesting to note that useState is actually built from useReducer. So with useReducer, we can actually achieve the same results as with useState. So then, when would it be preferable to use useReducer over useState? Well, again, looking here at the docs, they say useReducer is usually preferable to useState when you have complex state logic that involves multiple subvalues or when the next state depends on the previous one. So whereas useState might be better for dealing with primitive values, like numbers or booleans or strings, if we're dealing with a more complex data type like an object or array, useReducer might be a better choice. Also, useReducer might be a better choice if we have multiple state values changing upon the triggering of a particular action, like a button click or a mouse over event, for example. A lot of the difference, in my opinion, comes down to the way that useReducer allows us to write our code and therefore reason about our code when we're dealing with more complex data types. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show a side-by-side example between a functional component that uses useState and a functional component that does the same thing but uses useReducer. And we're going to start writing out some code in a second, but first let's just talk about the big idea of reducers. So a reducer essentially is a function that's going to take in some state and depending on an action or an action type that it receives is going to return a new state. And if you've worked with Redux before, the useReducerHook in React is basically the same as when you write a reducer in Redux. The useReducerHook in React, though, is not the same as the entirety of Redux itself. Because with Redux, you're using reducers in conjunction with a global store. In order to mimic that with React hooks, we need to use useContext in addition to useReducer. But this video is simply going to talk about the useReducerHook on its own and show how it can be used to manage perhaps more complex state locally in a component. All right, so with all that being said, let's get into an actual example. So like I said, we're going to start off with a stateless functional component, and we're going to use the useState hook. And then we're going to make the exact same example, but we're going to use the useReducerHook. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an H1, and I'm going to have that H1 display a guitar. So let's check that out in the browser. And there we go, a nice red guitar. Kind of looks like a Strat a little bit. Now, what I want to do is I want to create some buttons. One, when clicked on, will add additional guitars. Another one, when clicked on, will remove guitars. And a third one that will reset the number of guitars. So in order to do that, we're going to need to work with state, of course. So let's bring in useState, import React, and then useState from React. And we'll go ahead and we'll call useState. And what we're going to pass in here is we're going to pass in a number, which we're going to set initially to 1. And that's going to represent the number of guitars that we see displayed on the screen. So we're going to destructure that off of useState. We'll write const, create our array. And then in the array, we'll refer to that piece of state as numGuitars, or number of guitars. And then when we click on one of the buttons, we're going to call set numGuitars. And depending on which button we click, that'll either add to the number of guitars that we see, subtract from the number of guitars that we see, or reset the number of guitars that we see back to this initial count of 1. So in order for this numGuitars piece of state to actually affect the number of guitars that we see on the screen, we'll wrap this guitar icon into a string, and then we'll call the repeat method on it. And of course, this entire thing is going to have to be wrapped in curly braces so it can be evaluated as JavaScript. So the repeat method is a simple JavaScript inbuilt method that will repeat a string value depending on the argument that we pass in, which will be a number. So let's just say, for example, we passed in the number 2, we saved, we went back to the browser, and now we see 2 guitars. But what we want to do is pass in numGuitars as the argument, because whenever we click on one of the buttons that we're about to set up, those buttons are going to call set numGuitars and update the numGuitars piece of state. And of course, this whole example that I'm going to show is a pretty contrived example, but nonetheless, we're showing concepts here. We're showing how to use the API. And you can take these nuggets of information and extrapolate into your own projects. So with that being said, let's go ahead and we'll set up 3 buttons. With the first button, we want to add a guitar. With the second button, we're going to remove a guitar. And the third button is going to reset the number of guitars that we see. So at this point, we should see 1 guitar on the screen, and we should see these 3 buttons. And there we go. Now, in order for these buttons to actually do something and update the state, we're going to write on-click handlers on them. And in each of these on-click handlers, we're going to create a function that's going to call setNumGuitars. And because we want to add a guitar each time we click, we're going to say numGuitars plus 1. Then in the case where we want to remove a guitar, we can simply copy this and do numGuitars minus 1. And for the reset, we'll call setNumGuitars, but in this case, since we just want to reset it, we can just pass in 1, which was the initial state here. So at this point, our button should work. Let's go back to the browser. Let's try to add some guitars. There we go, and let's remove some guitars. Let's add some more. Let's reset, and we're back to 1. Now I know in this case, if we removed all the guitars and we kept clicking remove guitar, we'd get an error because we'd start getting into negative numbers, and we're dealing with a string icon here. But for the sake of this example, I just want to keep it simple, so I'm not going to deal with that right now. Just something to be aware of. Now the thing is, what if I want to come in here and add another piece of state? Let's say that whenever we add a guitar, we also want to show a happy face. So let's create another piece of state, which is going to be a Boolean value, and we'll set it initially to false. And we'll call that piece of state showEmoji. And the function that will update that state we'll call toggleShowEmoji. Now let's come down here after the buttons, and let's make an H2. And in this H2, let's just bring in a happy face. But the thing is, we want this happy face to display conditionally. That is, we only want to see it when we're adding guitars. So what we can do is we can wrap this in curly brackets. We can use that showEmoji piece of state, which is initialized to false. And we can use the logical AND operator. So in other words, if this is false, we won't see the happy face. But if this is true, or showEmoji is true, we will see it. Just to test it, let's flip this to true. And let's go check it out in the browser. And we see it. So let's go ahead and let's set this back to false. And let's go ahead and let's use our toggleShowEmoji function. So we're going to add it in our onClicks here. So let's say when we click the button for adding a guitar, we're going to call toggleShowEmoji, and we're going to pass in true. Then let's go to our remove guitar button. And when this button's clicked, we'll call toggleShowEmoji, but here we'll pass in false because we want it to disappear. And then on reset, we'll also call toggleShowEmoji and set it to false in that case. So now let's go test this out in the browser. So when we add a guitar, we should see another guitar being added here. We should also see that happy face emoji show up. And then if we go ahead and click remove guitar, we should see a guitar disappear, and we should see the happy face disappear as well. And it does. Let's add some more guitars. It shows up again. Let's reset. And the guitars disappear back to the initial state of 1, and the happy face disappears as well. So all's working so far. And yeah, writing these functions here is one way to do it. There are other ways to write it, of course. We could have written a function outside of the return statement and called that onClick, passing in various arguments and so forth. But now that we built this using useState, let's go ahead and see how we would implement it using useReducer. I've already got a file set up here on the right, which I just called reducer.jsx. And this is a stateless functional component. I'm exporting this function, and I'm bringing it into the app.js file here on line 2, import reducer from /reducer. So I'm going to comment out this code that we wrote before. And then down here, I'm going to use that reducer component. Now let's come into our reducer file, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in the useReducerHook. Import React, and then in the curly braces, useReducer. So within our reducer function, we're going to call useReducer. And in useReducer, we're going to pass in two arguments. The first one is going to be a function, and this function is actually going to be a reducer. Let's just call it reducer, just for simplicity's sake right now. And the second argument that we're going to pass in is going to be an object, which is going to represent the state of this component. Whereas in our app component, we brought in two separate pieces of state here using two instances of useState. In this reducer component, we're going to have those same two pieces of state, numGuitars and showEmoji, but they're going to live on this object. So the first property will be numGuitars, which will initially have a value of 1. And the second property will be showEmoji, which will initially have a value of false. Now, just like with useState, we're going to use array destructuring here. And what we're going to get back from this call to useReducer is the state object. And we're also going to get this method, which we'll call dispatch. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually just copy this h1 from the app component, and I'm going to paste it here into the reducer component. And I just realized that I named this reducer, which is a component, and this reducer that we're passing in as the reducer function to useReducer, both as reducer, which probably wasn't a good idea, but to distinguish them, you can see this one has a capital R and this one has a lowercase r. So they are two different functions. But anyway, at this point, we should be able to get this guitar icon to appear on the screen. But the one thing that we do have to do is we can't just say repeat numGuitars, because now numGuitars is a property. Oop, and I spelled it wrong here. Should be guitars with one T. So numGuitars is actually a property now on the state object. So we're going to have to refer to it as state.numGuitars, right? And numGuitars is initialized to 1. So we should just see one guitar on the screen. Let's go to the browser and check that out. Actually, before I do that, let's go ahead and let's just set up this reducer function here. So we could say const reducer. We'll make this an arrow function. And we won't do anything with it now. We'll just have it there because or else this is going to throw an error. So this will be filled in a second. But let's go to the browser and make sure that we see one guitar. Cool, so it's working. Now back to VS Code. Let's go ahead and set up our buttons, and we can again copy these from the app component. We'll paste them in here. Let's leave these on-click handlers, but let's get rid of everything inside of them for now. And for now, let's just put some empty arrow functions in here, which we're going to fill in a second. Let's flip back to the browser, make sure we see one guitar and 3 buttons. There we go. Now let's get on to actually writing our reducer. That is the reducer with the lowercase r function, which is the first argument to useReducer here. So the job of this reducer is going to be to take the state that it's given, and depending on an action that we dispatch from one of these function calls, from our on-click handlers on the buttons, we'll get a new state returned from this reducer. So the way a reducer is written is it takes the state, and then it takes an action. Inside of this reducer, we're going to write a switch statement. And this switch statement is going to listen to actions that we're going to dispatch when we click on any one of these buttons. So let's go ahead and set up our switch statement. So we'll say switch, and in here it's going to listen for action.type. Let me explain what I mean by action.type. So let's say, for example, when this first button is clicked on, the add guitar button, in this function here, we're going to call dispatch, which is coming from here. And what we're going to pass into dispatch is an object with a type property. So this first button will give a type of add guitar, like that. And writing the types like this with all uppercase letters and underscores to separate the words is just a Redux convention. Each one of these buttons is going to call dispatch. The difference is that each one is going to have a different type. So the second one can be remove guitar. And the third one can just be reset. So this object that's passed into each of these calls to dispatch this object is the action. So action.type corresponds to the type property on these objects. So this switch statement here is essentially listening for one of these types. With that being the case, no pun intended, we can go ahead and make the different cases in the switch statement. So in the case that action.type is add guitar, we're going to return whatever we want the new state to be. So remember, this is our state object. Now that we want to add a guitar, we want to return a new state object with the corresponding changes that we want to make to it. So what we're going to return is an object, and the numGuitars property now is going to be state.numGuitars plus 1. So that state, which is this object, is passed in here, and that numGuitars property, which was initialized to 1, is now going to be 2 when it's returned. And each time that this action is dispatched, this numGuitars property essentially is going to get incremented by 1. So now let's go and handle the other cases. We're going to say case remove guitar. If we get an action type of remove guitar, we're going to return basically the same thing as we did here, but we're going to decrement by 1. And then we have to handle the reset case. So if the action type is reset, we're going to return an object where the numGuitars is 1, because we want to reset it back to what it was initially. And then always we need to add a default case. In the case that no action type was recognized by this reducer, we just want to return the state. So let's flip over to the browser, and let's try clicking on these buttons and seeing what we get. So we initialize numGuitars to 1. Let's go ahead and click add guitar. That's working. Let's remove some guitars. That's working as well. Let's add some guitars back. And let's reset. And guitars goes back to 1. Now how about that happy face emoji? Let's copy over this line here from app.js. And as we did before with numGuitars, this is now going to be state.showEmoji, right? Because this is living on this state object here. The showEmoji property here is initialized to false. So now if we go to the browser, we shouldn't see this. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead into these objects that we're returning for the various cases and deal with toggling that showEmoji Boolean value. So in the case of add guitar, we'll have our showEmoji property on the state object be true. In the case of remove guitar, showEmoji property will be false. And we'll just copy that because that's going to be the same for the reset case. So now hopefully when we click these buttons, we should not only see guitars being added and removed, but also this happy face being added or removed. So let's go ahead and add a guitar. And there's the happy face. Let's go ahead and remove some guitars. Cool, happy face disappears. Let's add some more. And let's reset. So as you can see, the functionality turns out to be exactly the same as with this app.js component using useState. But I'll uncomment out what we did here in the app.js component, and you can see back to back the same functionality written out in two different ways, here with useState, here with useReducer. So one of the big differences that you can see here with the app component and the reducer component is that with the reducer, we have access to this dispatch method. So we're not changing the state directly, but rather we are dispatching an action with a type property. And then the reducer is looking at that action and its type property and handling it accordingly with these different cases here. One thing you can see is that in this example, we have our reducer actually living outside of the reducer component. So what we could do is we could actually make a separate file just for this reducer. We can come in here and we can make a new file. We'll call it reducer.js. And then let's go ahead and let's copy this. Actually, we'll just cut it out and then paste it into reducer.js. And now we can just export this as a default, like so. Save this and let's import it into our reducer component. And we'll say import reducer from /reducer. So this reducer that's being passed into useReducer is referencing this function imported here on line 2. In app.js, let's comment out all the useState stuff we did, just so we can confirm that this reducer is still working. And let's flip back to the browser and adding and removing, resetting, all seems to be working just fine. So as you can see here in the reducer component, saving the actual reducer function that we passed in here in its own file has cleaned up this file quite a bit. And the actual logic, like incrementing by 1 and decrementing by 1, is not really a concern here in this reducer component. We're simply dispatching actions with type properties, and this makes it very clear and very readable as to what's going on. We can see that clicking on this button dispatches an add guitar type, or remove guitar type, a reset type, etc. The other thing we can do with this is that if we did have, let's say, a child component, let's say here in this reducer component, we could pass down this dispatch method into that child component, and then that dispatch method would be available in the child component to be called with any type it wants to pass in. So thanks for checking out this video on useReducer and a comparison between useState and Reducer in React. If you liked the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you next time.